Hello and welcome to another edition of VAT Update from Tax Essentials for Advisors. I'm Ed Thompson. This week, in the latest from HMRC, we'll look at some updated guidance on exports and VAT. In cases, we'll think about a case about VAT on mobile phone plan bundles and another one on the timing of VAT recovery. And our VAT tip this week concerns the zero rating for exports. First up, then, HMRC has updated its guidance in Notice 703, which is its key guidance dealing with exports. Now, as many of you will know, where goods are exported out of the UK, they can generally be zero rated. But there are various important formalities that have to be met if you want to achieve that treatment. The updates to this guidance reflect the fact that the previous version contained some out-of-date terminology around customs processes and procedures, which have now been brought up to speed. But more interestingly, to my mind at least, there are also changes to the bit of guidance that have the force of law and concern where you can zero rate exports. The changes are minor, but they make clear that not only do you need to have evidence that the goods actually left the country, you also need to have evidence of supply. This is all the stuff you should be keeping anyway, and it's things like customer orders and sales contracts. We'll touch further on the zero rate for exports in today's tax tip later, but robust documentation is an absolute must. Our first case is a relatively complicated case about bundles of mobile phone allowances, and the VAT at stake was enormous, some £50 million. Although the case is complex, the essence of it can be summarised in relatively simple terms. When Leica Mobile sold bundles of allowances, so minutes, texts and data, was VAT effectively not due on the unused elements of those allowances? To dig slightly deeper into it, Leica Mobile argued that when customers bought the bundles, they were effectively buying a form of currency that they could use on calls, texts and data. But that initial transaction, in their view, wasn't a VAT supply. VAT was only due when this currency was exchanged for the actual services, and the portion paid to Leica Mobile that related to allowances that never got used, well, that would end up escaping VAT indefinitely. Given that only 5 to 10% of allowances in a planned bundle were typically used, that could lead to a significant VAT benefit. This had already been looked at by the first tier tribunal, and Leica Mobile had lost. Now it was being appealed to the upper tribunal. But the upper tribunal agreed with the FTT's analysis. The supply of the bundles was the real supply for VAT purposes, and VAT was due at that point. It wasn't simply some sort of preliminary step to the real supply. Receipt of the bundles was the customer's purpose in buying the bundle. Those bundles conferred a right to use, and the extent of actual use was irrelevant. Now, I don't usually comment on European cases as part of these updates, but this one really caught my eye. The actual status of EU case law is a little bit complicated post-Brexit. Basically, case law decided now is no longer binding in the UK, but it can still inform how the tribunals and courts approach things, because basically it helps us to understand the purpose of our law, much of which was, of course, drafted when we were in the EU. And this is a case about when you can recover VAT on costs. Should be simple, right? But remember, this is VAT. There are two things that influence the timing of when you can recover VAT. You have to have actually incurred the VAT in the first place, and you have to have the evidence, normally a VAT invoice, that supports the VAT recovery. In this case, the General Court of the EU said that it wasn't in line with EU law to stop someone from recovering VAT in a period where they incurred the VAT but didn't hold the VAT invoice. But they did hold the VAT invoice by the time the relevant VAT return was submitted. It's interesting to think about HMRC in this. There's definitely some guidance which suggests that in the UK you can only recover VAT in the period where you actually held the VAT invoice. This case suggests that that might not be quite right. And finally, my tax tip today is picking up on that point around export and zero rating. So as I mentioned, when you export goods from the UK, they can generally be zero rated. But it's not enough that the goods were actually exported from the UK. We need to make sure that we have the right kind of evidence of export and that this is retained in our records so that we can produce it for HMRC in the event of a VAT visit. If you don't have the right evidence, then there's a real possibility that HMRC will end up arguing that you should have charged VAT at the standard rate, and you're probably going to be in a mess and unable to pass that VAT on to your customer. So the name of the game is ensuring that you have really robust processes in place around gathering and keeping the right evidence for zero rating. The kinds of evidence that you're going to need are official and commercial transport evidence. Official evidence is an export declaration for the goods submitted to the Customs Declaration Service and a departure confirmation. You'll also need to keep the movement reference number of the declaration. Commercial transport evidence is things like authenticated seaway bills and airway bills. And this needs to be supplemented by evidence of supply, like those customer orders and sales contracts we mentioned earlier on today. My recommendation, look at the detailed conditions in that Notice 703 and make sure that the process you or your client has in place ticks all of the evidence boxes. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to the next edition in a couple of weeks' time.
Thanks, Ed. A key reminder that evidence is so crucial when it comes to convincing HMRC or a tribunal of your argument. Now, a quick reminder that our next webinar is live on the 26th of February. Andy and Rachel will be talking to Robin Milstead about the last chance to get ready for making tax digital for income tax. The first mandatory rollout is less than 6 weeks away, so not an instalment to miss. You can register at the link shown here.